Why do I feel stuck in my identity? Why do people find themselves then grasp that identity with such a grip? Change is hard. That's not an accusation. It's an honest question. Because most of us didn't pick our identity casually. We thought about it. We reflected. We tried to be sincere with ourselves. And yet over time, something odd happens. The very thing that once helped us feel grounded starts to feel restrictive. Growth feels harder. Change feels risky. And we find ourselves quietly defending versions of ourselves that no longer quite fit. So what's happening there? Part of the answer is that asking who you are is a very human impulse. Humans look for stability. We want coherence. We want to know ourselves well enough to move through the world without constantly renegotiating our sense of self. Identity helps with that. It gives structure. It gives continuity. It helps us explain ourselves to other people and to ourselves. So let's be clear about this. Identity itself isn't the problem. The problem shows up in how early, how rigidly, and how conclusively we ask that question. Because even though "who am I" sounds open, it quietly asks for a certain kind of answer. It pulls us toward labels, traits, short summaries, and once we land on those summaries, something subtle begins to happen. The identity stabilizes, and stabilization feels good. Until it doesn't. When identity stabilizes too early, it creates inertia. The answer becomes something you protect instead of something you keep examining. Growth starts to feel like inconsistency. Change begins to feel like self-betrayal. And phrases like "that's just who I am" stop being descriptions and start becoming defenses. Not because people are arrogant, not because they aren't trying, but because stability feels safer than uncertainty. Now here's an important distinction. Most people do self-reflect. They think about their behavior, their patterns, their motives, their past. They replay conversations. They notice what hurts and what doesn't. The issue isn't a lack of reflection. The issue is the lens they're reflecting through. Every one of us looks inward through lenses shaped by survival, by reward and punishment, by adaptation, by the environments we grew up in and the meanings we had to build to get through them. As those lenses thicken over time, reflection doesn't stop. It just becomes skewed. People aren't unaware. They're locally rational inside distorted fields. They examine themselves honestly, but through optics designed to protect them, not necessarily to clarify them. And when you ask "who am I" through a distorted lens, the answer can feel solid and convincing while still being incomplete. That's where the hidden cost begins to show up. When identity becomes the starting point instead of the outcome, it freezes a moving system. A human being isn't a static object, it's a process, a trajectory, a constantly updating relationship between history, environment, orientation, and choice. But identity language doesn't like processes. It likes conclusions. So people don't stop changing, they just change around the edges of what they've already say is acceptable. Certain traits are allowed to grow, others quietly get locked down. Some possibilities are ruled out, not because they're wrong, but because they don't fit the story anymore. That's when growth starts to feel exhausting instead of alive. What actually helps people understand themselves more deeply isn't trying to name themselves more precisely, it's understanding how they got here. When attention shifts away from defining and toward tracing, something changes. Instead of reaching for a label, you start looking for a map. You begin to notice the forces that shaped you, the adaptations you had to make, the patterns that once protected you, the meanings you inherited or constructed, the orientation you've been living out, often without realizing it. And when you do that, identity doesn't disappear. It clarifies, not as a label, but as a perspective. You start to see why certain reactions feel automatic, why some identities feel comforting, why some changes feel threatening even when they're healthy. Understanding how you got here doesn't erase identity. It gives it depth. Identity becomes a snapshot instead of a verdict, a moment in a longer story, not the final word. That's also where growth stops feeling like hypocrisy, because you're no longer saying, "This is who I am and I must defend it." You're saying, "This is how I arrived here, and I can choose how I move from here." Change becomes reorientation, not self-rejection. So if identity has ever started to feel heavy, if growth has felt like a threat instead of an invitation, if you've ever felt loyal to a version of yourself that no longer quite fits, it might not be because you haven't reflected enough. It might be because you've been asking a question that closes the door too early. Because "who am I" sounds open, but it quietly asks you to stop moving. It asks you to summarize something that's still unfolding. And maybe that's why so many people feel stuck defending identities they once needed, but don't fully live in anymore. So the question I've had to start asking myself isn't meant to define me. It's meant to explain me. Not who am I, but why am I?